We are now on doing Romano Guardini's book, The Lord, and we're on chapter 13, The Trial. Now, one of the things that Guardini points out here in this chapter is that there's nothing, when we get to the account of the trial of Jesus, there's nothing exaggerated, he says, or glorified. He says it's not difficult to imagine how these reports would have read had the apostles chosen to dramatize them. So he urges that when we look at this, he says, let's take them as they stand, line by line, he says, careful to let nothing speak but the sacred record. So in this chapter, it's a bit longer because that's what Guardini's doing. He's going to take the sacred record as he understands it, and he puts together all the Gospels, okay? And he points out here that it's in Matthew's chapter 26, Luke chapter 22, Mark is in 14, and John is in 18. He's going to put together the account of the four Gospels of the trial, and then Guardini's going to explain it in such a way as to deepen our appreciation of how direct and historical, in a way, these accounts are. And this goes back to his preface of the book, where he wants to get at history free, as he calls it, of the dust of usage. Now, nowhere is that more important than in the giving the account of the passion and the death and resurrection of the Lord. No, I mean, so he's really going to practice what he preaches in the preface to the book. And he wants nothing to speak but the sacred record. So he takes us through. Jesus is still speaking to his disciples the words about the hour, quote unquote, that is now come. What does that mean, the hour? The hour is when Judas appears, accompanied by a large crowd, sent by the high council. Some are carrying staves, and they are members of the Sanhedrin troops who are forbidden to bear arms. Others, with swords, doubtless belong to the temple guard and have been commanded to maintain order. Now, Judas has arranged a signal with them. We cannot read the passage without being shaken by the plumbless baseness of the sign. Whomever I kiss, that is he, lay hold of him. So he strides up to Jesus. He greets him with a peace to thee, Master, and kisses him. Jesus replies, Friend, for what purpose hast thou come? And according to Luke, he asks, Judas, dost thou betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And turning to the crowd, he asks, Whom do you seek? And they reply, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replies, I am he. And John notes that when he says that, they are overcome by this unearthly majesty of the Lord. And they're profoundly shaken, and they recoil and fall to the ground. So, and then Jesus repeats the question, and they answer as before. Then, simultaneously giving them free hand and protecting his followers. This is very, very important. He's allowing this to occur. He's completely free. And he's allowing them to act according to their free will too. And so, and at the same time, he's going to protect those who are his own. Okay? So there's this double aspect to it. Jesus says, I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way. And Guardini reminds us that it's very likely it is to this imperious request that the disciples owe their very lives. So that's really a remarkable thing that happens here during the trial of Jesus. Now the cohort closes in on Jesus. Now Peter is unable to bear the sight of the men's hands on the Lord. He draws his sword and slashes right and left. But Jesus, says Guardini, like a grown-up, okay, calling a child to order, tells him to put up his blade. No earthly sword can possibly cope with the gravity of the situation. This is a moment that's so profound and so dark that an earthly sword is not going to be any good. And he goes on, if he wished protection, other powers, infinitely triumphant, would come at his bidding. But then, how are the scriptures to be fulfilled that it must take place? So there's this mystery here of the movement of history, okay, played out. And of course, that's one of Guardini's great themes. And he touches the ear of the wounded servant, and it is healed. Then the soldiers bind Jesus and lead him away. Now, at this point, terrified, the disciples flee. And they're not only fleeing for fear that they too might be seized. Guardini reminds us that they are utterly dismayed and consternated as well. In spite of everything, up to this moment, they have expected their master to crush all opposition by some mighty sign of mission. When instead he's taken prisoner, they cannot help but conclude that he's not the victorious bearer of all power in heaven and on earth that in their opinion the Messiah must be. So the consternation and confusion of this moment for the disciples is almost unspeakable. Jesus is led first to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the ruling high priest. He's apparently a man of such influence that the important case is at once referred to him. But without asking a single question or taking any measure whatsoever, Annas sends the prisoner still tied to Caiaphas, in whose home the first hearing is held. Now, Peter and John have followed at a distance, and since John is well known to the house of the high priest, and he's able to accompany Jesus into the courtyard, Peter remains outside the door, waiting to see what will happen. Now, what goes on inside the courtyard, according to Guardini, is not yet the real trial, which according to Jewish law can take place only in the daytime. It's a kind of preliminary hearing, okay? And above all, an opportunity for those in power to enjoy their victory. So they got him, they've nabbed him, and that's the sense of this. Thus, the high priest questions the prisoner as to his teaching and followers, and we can well imagine, says Guardini, his expression and the tone of his voice. Jesus realizes that he is not the least interested in truth. Well, that really is the first time in this chapter that Guardini is going to introduce us here to a main theme, which is how truth gets corrupted during these hearings and the trial of Jesus. And Guardini takes special note of it. And of course, I would tie that again to the preface of the book. He wants to free history, both divine and human history, from the dust of usage. So obviously, the theme of how the trial of Jesus corrupts truth interests him. Okay, and I think it should interest us. And so Guardini is going to help us with that. And so we note that. Okay, here's what he says. Jesus realizes that he is not the least interested in truth, and that the sentence has long since been determined, and that the hearing is only a lie and a mockery. Okay? So he refused to answer. He says, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews gather, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. Behold, these know what I have said. So this is really a very important point too, is that there's no hidden gospel. The gospel is good news. It's a proclamation. And so that's an emphasis of this part here as the church, the apostles recorded this. They recorded, as Guardini said, in a very straightforward manner, because it's important that we're not dealing with some hidden knowledge. We're dealing with what is openly the fact of the matter. And, that really does remind me of church teaching on the media, for example, where, and you see this in Inter Mirifica in Vatican II, the first document of Vatican II, and you see it also in Pope John the 23rd's, one of his most famous documents, Peace on Earth. In there, he says people have a right to be truthfully informed about public events. And so this idea of Jesus, I have spoken openly to the world, it's really tied to that, okay? It's really tied to that. So when he says that, one of the servants, seeing an opportunity of distinguishing himself, slaps Jesus' face. Is that the way you answer the high priest? But Jesus, with a calm weightier than any action, replies, if I have spoken ill, bear witness to the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Okay. So that again, we can see how twisted the proceedings have already become toward Jesus. Okay. In the meantime, John spoke to the gatekeeper, the lady who kept the gates, and she lets Peter in. In a cold night, someone has kindled a fire in the inner court, and they all gather around it, warming themselves, also Peter. The slave girl who has let him in sees him there and accuses him of being a friend of Jesus. And there follows the terrible scene of Peter's triple denial. But he began to curse and to swear, I do not know this man you are talking about. And the cock crows the second time, And Jesus, who was just being let out of the house to prison, turned and looked upon Peter. And the disciple remembers his words. Before the cock crows twice, you shall deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. You know, that's a real point of meditation. If you can, I think one of the most remarkable meditations of place I ever experienced was reading that section during a Stations of the Cross. I believe it was a Stations of the Cross that had been prepared years ago for Cursillo retreats. And there's that moment that Jesus turns and looks upon Peter and catches him, as it were, in fulfilling what he had said would happen with his sin. And the point of that meditation is to invite the gaze of Jesus on us. And there's nothing more salutary, I can imagine, than allowing Jesus in to those dark places in our hearts and letting him see them. We know he sees them anyway, but it's that moment of our recognition of his sight that counts. And that's certainly what happened to Peter, and it engendered his contrition, his contrite response. He goes out and he bitterly weeps, but doesn't despair. But he bitterly weeps. So there's that distinction there too. The Lord is in prison now, guarded by servants of the tribunal. Everyone knows who the captive is. The question whether or not he is the Messiah has stirred all Jerusalem already, okay? How baseness, says Guardini now, commenting, how baseness rears its head when sacred greatness, whose power is previously has been forced to concede, becomes impotent. So gradually, Jesus is actually allowing these people, first he concedes his power to them, and then completely he becomes impotent, unable to respond. He makes himself completely and in a self-emptying way, freely vulnerable to them. From what evil depths, says Guardini, must it spring, he says, this hunger for revenge against holiness. In other words, there comes points in the darkest moments of our history as human beings where the hunger for revenge against goodness completely overtakes everything. The guards bind the defenseless prisoner's eyes, they strike him and mock, and they say, prophesy, who is it that struck you? It is, in truth, the hour and the power of darkness. And one seems to sense, says Guardini, an invisible non-human force behind those who blaspheme and mock at the Son of God. So it's that whole idea here that we've seen before, that the evil is compounded. It's demonic, okay? And there's the human level of it, but then there's this demonic level of it. It's so inhuman as to be almost a product. I mean, almost, not really almost. He says it seems to be non-human, and by that he means demonic. So again, Guardini's trying to clear the decks to make us understand what's really at the core of the passion. this fight against demonic darkness. Okay? Early the next morning, the high council is summoned. Now they can have the formal trial. Elders, scribes, and priests, and all of them are triumphant enemies at the high tide of their power. So they're raring to go, and they're ready to get him. Okay? They have decided that Jesus shall be accused of blasphemy, since it's punishable by death. However, the law precisely defines the crime. Blasphemy is the mention of God's name in slanderous speech, and as yet there's no evidence has been produced of the prisoner's guilt. Moreover, the charges brought against him are confused and contradictory. Once again, getting at this drama, this crisis of truth that's going on here in the Passion. We got contradictory and confused testimony. And the figure and works of the Lord are so pure that not even total unscrupulousness is able to wring a, quote, crime, end of quote, from it. In other words, they can't really find anything criminal. Jesus does not answer a single charge and remains silent, even when the high priest orders him to speak. The whole trial is a lie, says Guardini, just as earlier the questions with which the scribes and the Pharisees had attempted to trap him were lies. It would have been, according to Guardini, it would have been child's play to point out the contradictoriness of the accusals, to strengthen the impression of candidness which he could not fail to make on all who saw him, to seize the offensive against his accusers. Guardini continues, it's painful to watch Jesus do absolutely nothing to retard his obvious fate, unless we remember that he does not wish to retard it. In the night of Gethsemane, which we've already talked about, he had accepted it. And what now happens, all that the harsh, hypocritical, cowardly, confused agents of Satan undertake against him is only the form in which his Father's will finds expression. That's quite a two very hard concepts to put together. Thy will be done, and I accept what these people have done to me. And he accepts it silently, right? Guardini continues, we will never understand what is happening until we experience the deep, resolute calm that is in Jesus. Okay? That's important. There's nothing oppressive about it. Nothing desperate or resigned. Nothing insolent. Okay? Here is only perfect calm, knowing, watchful, readiness for the ultimate. Okay, so in other words, Jesus inside is, as Guardini sees him, is completely at peace. He's entered into the stillness, into the very center. He's not being tossed around inside, even though the external circumstances are exactly the opposite. When the high priest sees that they are getting nowhere, he changes his tactics, and he suddenly flings the official formula at the accused. I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou art the Christ, the Son of God. Now Jesus answers. This is no trap, says Guardini, but an expression of the supreme authority of his people. And though hardened against God, this people comes from God and has a right to demand information on Jesus' origin and mission. So there's that right to be properly informed. Even on the part of the hard-hearted people, they have a right to know. And so Jesus gives them that right. It is the question that is to set his salutary destiny in motion. So he replies, "You have said it. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power." That's power with a capital P. So at the right hand of God. The power and coming upon the clouds of heaven. So power in heaven equals God here. Okay? The high priest responds with the pathetic gesture that commonly established guilt. He rends his garments. "He has blasphemed," says the high priest. "What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all cry, "He is liable to death." Here's what Guardini says about this moment in our salvation history. Law and order have vanished. Violence and treachery remain. The claim to be the Messiah is simply accepted as proven blasphemy. Notice that, okay? Guardini continues. Think of that. Proven blasphemy without any discussion. No attempt is made to test the possible truth of the claim, neither legally, with questions as to how Jesus substantiates his statement. Okay? So, if this was really truthful and it was done by real due process, there would be questions about that. They could offer legal questions. That's the first one, which would be, how does Jesus substantiate his statement? A question like that. Nor do they try a religious way of going about it. Now, notice that the word religion here, the ties that bind, religio, okay? And here, it's the community that has to go through a examination by the wisest and most pious priests. In other words, that was another way to test it. You could take it up with the wisest and the most pious about how to get through it. But the mere fact that the name of God appears in his answer, in Christ's answer, is sufficient. According to Guardini, an offense, quote unquote, at last. Immediately it is registered and sentence pronounced. But there's one hitch. The Jewish nation has lost its judiciary sovereignty. Okay? That is, it no longer has the right to pass the sentence of death. Where this is necessary, the representative of the Roman state, the procurator, must both confirm the verdict of the great Sanhedrin and execute sentence. So they bind Jesus again, lead him to the praetorium, where Pontius Pilate holds his court of justice. Then Guardini goes into the section of the chapter about Pilate. And what I want to highlight about that is that Pilate is, we often don't get to the depths of who Pilate is here and what he tries to do. And Guardini helps us see that, okay? So I want to take a look at how, first of all, the dialogue between the Jews and Pilate. The Roman, have you charges against this man? the Jews. If we had none, we would not have brought him to you. Then Pilate says, then take him and judge him according to your own law. The Jews say, we have no right to sentence to death, and they begin their accusals. They have changed on the way, though. Notice this. Blasphemy is not mentioned anymore. They fear the Roman would say it was not his affair. Instead, they charge Jesus with the offense which must appear gravest in the eyes of the occupation of Rome, sedition. And that's what they do. The Jews say to him, we have found that he incites people to revolt, encourages them to withhold the tax money from Caesar, and calls himself king. And Jesus is silent. Also to the procurator's question as to what he has to say to the charges, Pilate wonders exceedingly. Now this is certainly, says Guardini, anything but the usual behavior of defendants. They'll try anything and everything to save their lives. This man is silent. So Pilate takes him inside where he can question him privately. And then there's that back and forth between Pilate and Jesus. And Jesus comes back to him by, if you are only questioning me formally as part of the trial, I have nothing to say. That's how Guardini summarizes that encounter. But perhaps you are asking because something in you desires to know. That's something I will answer. But Pilate only replies haughtily, am I a Jew? What is your Messiah to me? Your own people and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Nevertheless, Jesus sees that there are depths to this Roman, and he proclaims himself. He is king, yes, but his kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my followers would have fought that I might not be delivered to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here. Art thou a king? You sayest, I am a king. That is why I was born and why I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Now Pilate thinks. He knows where he is. The man is obviously one of those wandering philosophers who deny the earthly realm in an attempt to establish an ideal realm of truth. A harmless utopian, to put it in modern speech. For the idea that what the stranger says might be actually true, in the trusting and passionate sense of the word, he has only the skeptical shrug of the cultivated of his day. What is truth? So he can't go very far. Yet, his judiciary eye sees clearly, so he goes outside and announces to the Jews, I find no guilt in him. And Guardini really makes that clear. He does that a number of times, Pilate does. And Pilate is really trying to get him off, okay? But as we know from the Passion accounts, that doesn't work, okay? So he sends him to Herod, and coming back from Herod, Pilate and Herod become friends that very day. And Guardini sees in that this way in which the whole government is going to come against Jesus here. Now Pilate summons the populace and the entire Sanhedrin and declares formally that the charges are groundless. So he keeps trying. Not only an administrator of justice, but also a sound politician, he hopes to play out one power against the other, the masses against their rulers. So he brings up the custom which to free, Jesus or Barabbas. You know, we know this all from the Passion accounts. But even at that point, there's also that moment where the wife of Pilate sends him the message that she had a dream about Jesus that had nothing to do with him. And so Pilate tries this, and the people shout for the crucifixion of Jesus. And he tries to placate them. What then am I to do with Jesus? They all say, let him be crucified. And then Pilate asks, why? What evil has he done? And he says, I find no crime, deserving of death in him. I'm going to chastise him. And they release him, but they only bawl the louder. Let him be crucified. Pilate has Jesus flogged. Now, Guardini points out, that's a terrible contradiction of interest. Those sentenced to crucifixion were first flogged to intensify the punishment. Actually, says Guardini, Pilate means well, if the word can be uttered, he says, at all in such a connection. The Roman knows mob psychology and thinks he can handle the situation. They must see blood flow, must have the satisfaction of inflicting pain. Then they'll be satisfied. But no. He has Jesus flogged. It's enough to remember that men often died when they were flogged like that. At the sight of the horribly stripped one, the soldiers, knowing that he had been accused of attempting to usurp royal dignity, put the cloak on Jesus and all, right? And Guardini ties that to a pagan custom known as the Comedy of the Shadow King. Then the soldiers of the procurator took Jesus into the praetorium, gathered together about him, the whole cohort, and they mock him and spit on him and so on. After they had their will, Pilate comes out and tries again. He brings Jesus out. Behold, I bring him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus appears wearing the cloak and the crown of thorns, and Pilate says, behold the man. But the only answer he receives is, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate replies, there's no Roman law according to which this man should be condemned to death. If such a Jewish law exists, they should apply it. At this, they drop the charges brought to impress the Roman, and they fall back upon their own trial. Notice that. So they shift their story to get a verdict. We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he has made himself Son of God. At that point, Pilate's startled, and then he takes him inside again and has that conversation with Jesus where Jesus again refuses to speak to him, and then finally Jesus says, you would have no power over at all over me were it not given you from above. And, at this point, Pilate wants to get away from this for a number of reasons, okay, according to Guardini. He tries it one more time. He brings him out, sits at the judge's seat, and he says, behold your king. They sense their victory and only clamor more, away with him, crucify him. Pilate, and then Guardini says, we cannot help sympathizing with him, with this weak man, he says, bullied against his better judgment to injustice. He says, shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar. Pilate gives up. After the symbolical, also paltry gesture of the hand washing, he makes the ridiculous announcement, I'm innocent of the blood of this just man. See to it yourselves. To this, the gruesome answer of the mob, his blood be on us and on our children. Pilate releases Barabbas, surrenders Jesus to their will. The account rings with sacred truth. It's never rhetorical. It's rendered simply and objectively. Not a word about Jesus' possible emotions. No hint of the author's reaction. We have only to imagine what a modern reporter would have made of this story, so quote unquote, to feel the straightforwardness with which this event, upon which the eternal salvation of the world depended, is recorded. That's why it is so convincing, but why it appears almost insignificant. Every sentence is packed with immeasurable content, but only so much is revealed as the individual reader's love and earnestness is capable of bringing to light. So Guardini is saying that this passion is impossible to get to without the light of love. That's very important. He says, how strangely disturbing Jesus' conduct. We must shake off a 2,000-year-old simplification of Christ as our dear Savior, prototype of patience and love, long enough to realize how incomplete this representation, how little known he really is. What has happened? No mighty struggle has taken place. No particularly dramatic words have fallen. No mysterious greatness strong enough to influence the enemy has broken through. Not even a negative power sweeping aside all pretense and bodily flinging Jesus' haters upon him to put an end to him there, then and there. No. Step by step, the trial plods to its intended conclusion. And Jesus, apart from the cold calculation which men respond to as the holiest being that ever walked on earth, what is most disquieting about the whole account of the end is the sudden unanimousness of Jesus' enemies, diabolical antithesis of the peace and harmony of God's kingdom. Pharisees and Sadducees, they used to oppose each other. They're together. Herod and Pilate, Pharisees and Romans. All these people together go after Jesus. It's frightening, he says, to witness this hate-torn world suddenly united for one brief hour against Jesus. And what does he do? Every trial, in reality, says Guardini, is a struggle, but not this one. Jesus refuses to fight. He proves nothing. He denies nothing. He attacks nothing. Instead, he stands by and lets events run their course. More, at the proper moment, he says precisely what is necessary for his conviction. His words and attitude have nothing to do with the logic or demands of a defense. Their source lies elsewhere. The accused makes no attempt to hinder whatever is to come, but his silence is neither that of weakness nor of desperation. It's divine reality. Silence as divine reality, says Guardini, full, holy consciousness of the approaching hour, perfect readiness. His silence brings into being what is to be. We contrast his silence with, nonetheless, in the dark, a struggle is raging. The struggle against truth. So self-evident that the whole trial seems to have but one aim, says Guardini. What is that aim? To obscure truth, long enough for the desired sentence to be pronounced without an outburst, any outburst of truthful enthusiasm for Jesus or of truthful terror that would send men flying from the scene. No defense like that. And the defendant declines to defend himself. In this turbulent hour, says Guardini, only truth per se takes the stand, truth itself, and therefore must be trampled beyond recognition before the sentence can fall. So this trampling of the truth is the whole point of the trials. Okay? This is most evident in Pilate, and that's where Guardini shifts our notion of Pilate. He says, it is not easy to do him justice. After all, He was the supreme judiciary authority in the country, and whatever Rome's callousness with regard to certain aspects of imperial domination, the law was always endowed with a majesty whose appearance, at least, every judge was obliged to protect. One might suppose that Pilate was simply without conscience. That's wrong, says Guardini. He says that this would not explain his behavior during Jesus' trial. Had he really lacked integrity, he could have directed the trial or have let it direct itself, so that the sentence against Jesus would have been inflicted as against a dangerous agitator. Actually, he does nothing of that sort. He insists rather upon the defendant's innocence, repeatedly, to the end, and then, fully conscious of the illegality of the decision, pronounces a sentence of death, and what a death! We are likely to overlook the contradiction, and that's exactly true. Or we explain it away with Pilate's weakness. That's the classic thing I think people do. Guardini says, this is insufficient to just do that, to just say, oh, it's his weakness. The procurator is sucked into the depths of the power of darkness, into a confusion so dark and deep that he is no longer sensible of the gruesome and ignominious folly he is committing. So the darkness completely overtakes this Roman procurator. But Guardini is implying the warning is for us. Thus, the trial. Chapter 13 of our section of Romano Guardini's book, The Lord.